Reincarnating books. What do we mean? Bringing new works back to life, new covers, new changes. And what do we do if we get the rights back? And even more tonight. So brought in a bunch of friends to help talk about this one. So let's go around and see who has decided to join us tonight. So Alma, you are up first.
Hi, my name is Alma Alexander, and I'm your reincarnation specialist. I'm in the middle of my second reincarnation project right now. And I will be talking about both of those stories in due time. I write fantasy mostly, and other stuff like science fiction and what have you. I've had more than 20 books published, and at least some of them are now revenants as well. So we'll talk about that.
Layla?
Hi, I'm Layla. I have also just finished, actually, a revisionist project. I got all the rights back to all of my books from 2 different publishers, and that was a fun way to end last year, was putting those back out. So there were definitely some recovers. There was a lot of changes, so it'll be fun to talk about that tonight.
And Alledria?
Hi, I'm Alledria Hurt, and as for my redoing experience, I've had 6 books, a total of 2 series that I've either done major overhauls on or completely recovered.
So let's actually start with the fun part of the topic tonight, right? One of the things that we get into a lot of the time. So if you're in indie, obviously a lot of the time, we refresh covers, we maybe refresh blurbs, we do these sorts of things all the time. But for things that we do that are traditionally published and working with traditional publishers, it's a little bit more complex. Often publishers may go out there, refresh covers, refresh blurbs, and things like this as well. But let's actually start with the fun piece of what happens when you go to get your rights back from your publisher. This is something I've been through and done. This is something a lot of us have gone through and done at some point in time. And I mean, even last year, we finally had a book issued after having a book that was kind of in developmental hell for 3 years. We finally pulled the rights back and got it to another publisher to go out the door. So Alma, let's start talking a little bit about some of your experience just in the act of getting rights back. And let's kind of talk about that.
All right. Story 1. When I was a very young, very green writer, I wrote a 250,000 word fantasy, which was a doorstopper. And I was in New Zealand at the time, and I had contact with New Zealand publishers, and they looked at this thing and they liked it, but they said, split this puppy up because it's huge. So eventually what they did was they published it as a duology. They published it in 2 books, which was great. I got 2 sets of honorariums for it, which kind of, double the money, double the joy kind of thing. That was all fine. But the first book now ended on an unholy cliffhanger, which was not meant to be, a book ender. It was meant to take it to the next chapter, not the next book. Stick a pin in that. I moved to the United States, and the books got republished in the US, again, as a duology by HarperCollins, one of the big ones. So HarperCollins took these books and they renamed the first one. The whole thing was called Changer of Days. They renamed the first one by committee, The Hidden Queen, which I didn't like, but I had to live with. The second book was now The Changer of Days, it kept the original kind of whole book title. In their wisdom, at some point during this lifetime, they decided to let book 2, aka the second half of this novel, go out of print. The thing that was out there now was the first half of the book, aka the first book of the duology, which ended on that aforementioned cliffhanger, and the second book was now no longer available. And HarperCollins would not let me have the rights back to that first book for 7 long years, and only did that after I begged and bullied and badgered and generally made a complete nuisance out of myself for 7 years. And they finally said, oh, okay, you can have it back. I finally republished that book in 1 volume, as it always should have been, as a 20th anniversary edition, for which I got brand new art as a cover and all that. It's a beautiful book, and I'm really pleased with it. But dear God, it took decades for that to happen. And I don't understand the business model which lets half a series go out of print and then hangs on for dear life for the other half of the series. And I mean, how does that benefit anybody?
Keeping the asset on the books. So how about you, Layla, since you just have gone through the process of getting rights back?
Well, this was actually my second time. My first time, my first novel back in end of 2014 was picked up by Wayward Inc. And Wayward Inc. went out of business around 2016, somewhere in there, like 3 months after All Romance eBooks closed. Wayward Inc. shut down. So here I was a baby author. I had 4 books that they had published. They had 4 manuscripts in addition to those that they'd accepted. We were actually 6 weeks away from releasing the next book, and I found myself back at the beginning. And I was real fortunate. I had just gone to an event in New York, and I had learned, I'd never done a table pitch. I learned how to do them. And I had pitched a short story to Sarah at CHBB and Encompass Inc. And she said, when you get this written, send it to me. Well, by the time I sent it to her, I'd gotten the rights back. I was actually given my covers and everything by Wayward Inc. with the rights reversion. So I contacted Sarah and I said, here's this story. And when she was like, well, do you have anything else by any chance? So she really liked the story and she accepted it. And I said, you know what? As a matter of fact, I have these 8 manuscripts. And I said 4 of them would be re-releases and 4 would be new releases. Are you interested? And she had me send them one in each separate email to her. And in the end, she republished the first 4 and then released the 4 that had never been released. And I did several other releases with her. Towards the end of last year, though, I realized I had been sourcing my cover art. I have a wonderful photographer I go to. I'd been getting involved in these shared world things. And I just felt like, you know what? I was ready to do everything just completely as an indie at this point, because I was already doing so much of it on my own. So I wrote her just a quick email. I'd always had a good relationship with her, and she had no issue turning rights back over to me and giving me my covers back as well. So I got the rights to my books back. I got my covers back. I had a little bit more trouble with the other publisher, and I'm not going to name them, that I was working with. It took 2 letters and me basically saying, look, I gave you 5 books of a series up front. You put all 3 of the ones that have been released out late. I've got people who I can't even tell when the next book is coming out. I can't advertise the series because you're not releasing them on the dates that we agreed to. So I'm going to go public on social media with that if you will not honor this second letter of me asking for my rights back. Unfortunately, I didn't have to go forward on social media. I got the response that I was after. She returned everything to me. And because I had sourced the cover art, the only thing I had to do was take their logo off and basically just redo the font and not have their logo on the book so that I could reissue them and release the 2 books that had not made it out in the 2 years since I'd given them the 5 books. So it hasn't been a fight really to get any of them back, but it definitely left me with the knowledge of, unless somebody comes along from like New York City, I will do it myself from now on.
Alledria, have you ever been through the process of reversion?
Just once, and totally by accident.
I thought we had talked about this at some point. Yeah.
Yeah, for those who don't know, I had one of those moments, those crises of faith, and stopped publishing at one point. And because I had a book that was out with a publisher, when I told them that I was pulling out of publishing, they reverted my rights. I did not realize they had reverted my rights, so I'm currently still not sure what I'm doing with that particular book. So Yeah, but I was also in a very, very, very dark place at that point. So still figuring that one out.
Well, and there's a couple things I'll throw in there because I've worked with a lot of people around the rights reversion process before and everything else. I mean, this is one of the most important clauses you can get into in your contract. So when you sign the publishing contract, understanding, here's what your rights clause, understanding that reversion clause. And, I recently had somebody bring a contract to me that had no reversion clause. For all practical purposes, the only way they could get their rights back was in the event the publisher went bankrupt. And I've seen even worse criteria and things around rights reversions, very predatory things. So this is one of the first things I always recommend people look at in their contracts is know what the conditions are to get your rights back. And this is one of those things that, depending on the size publisher you're working with, if you're working with Big Five, if you're working with even the mid-size, if you're working with New York, they're pretty standard clauses usually about what your rights reversions are. But when you get into mid-size and smaller publishers, it's everything over the board from just ask for it up to, no, we don't even put a clause in there. Once we've got your rights, we've got them. So that's actually one of the big things that I recommend everybody look at. And then, Layla, one of the things you're talking about here gets really important, which is your covers, right? Because typically the publisher doesn't even necessarily own the art. They don't own the covers. Typically those are rights still reside with the artist that created them. And if the publisher licensed them, they can't actually pass those rights on to you. You'd have to then approach the artist and say, I want to license these rights or license them again, unless it's done as a work for hire and they've bought those covers. And I mean, depending on who it is, as to whether or not they'll do that. So, I mean, these are the kinds of things to look at a lot about reversion of rights and getting into all of that sort of thing.
Okay, you want to talk about covers? Let's talk about covers. My second story is my young adult series, the World Weaver series. And the first 3 books of that got published by HarperCollins, again, the big one. And that was the classical traditional path. They had the hardcovers, and then there was supposed to be paperbacks and what have you. They did the covers, they did everything. But these books turned up at HarperCollins just before the bloodbath of 2008, which some of you may or may not know about, which means that everybody kind of just went away. And I thought that my editor at HC was a very senior, and I have to say this, exceptionally brilliant one. I thought that she was going to be safe. She wasn't. At some point during the lifetime of these books, she sent me an email saying she was being, and I quote, let go. So she disappeared. I was handed over to another editor who kind of took over in the middle. All the work had been done already, so he was just a sort of caretaker editor, and he lasted 6 months before he sent me an email saying he was going to go to a different publisher. I got a third editor who really didn't care about the books at all. In the same time period, I had about 4 or 5 different publicists who did or didn't do anything much at all. I need not tell you that these books did not do really well. They kind of just, they never had the backing. And to the point that the third one came out in hardcover and it never really went to paperback at all because it just never got there. Fast forward, I got the dance of getting the rights back. I finally got all those rights back. And there was a sort of a young mom and pop publisher happening at the time, run by a friend of mine. And I wanted these books back out there. So I gave her the publishing rights for the trilogy, and I also wrote a 4th book in the series. So she got the 3 books plus another one that had never been published before. So she had covers on there, which, to be perfectly honest, I wasn't mad about, but, they worked. That was fine. But she folded in a major way in terms of promotion, publicity, whatever. And again, those books were out there, but they were never out there, really. And I finally wrote to her and I said, look, I'm taking them back because I really want these books out there and you're not doing the right thing with them. And she said, oh, okay. So I went back, and I don't know if you can see this, but I commissioned original art for these things, and I reissued the definitive collector's set of these things, and they are now out there. And that's number 3. Number 4 is coming out at the end of the year, and I'm going to have all 4 books out there in a collectible edition with matching cover art, and which actually has something to do with the contents of the books, because I worked with the artist and I basically said, this is what I want on the cover, and he produced what I wanted. So yeah, I think they said don't judge books by their covers, but you do. I mean, how can you not? You pick up, your eye just latches onto something and you go, oh, that looks interesting. And then you go and take a look at what's behind it. But you do. That's the first impact that you actually get. And cover art can make or break a book. And I think that a lot of the sort of the really bare bones indie writers, the mistake they make is they try to save money. So they come up with these really awful self-made art kind of covers that people who can write well are not necessarily designers, and they don't know what goes into a good cover, and they just slap together something to get their book published, and they're doing their book such a disservice.
Well, and I mean, I even know a lot of cover artists that are also writers. Sometimes they know when they're not the best person to create the cover for their own book. And I think this actually leads into kind of the next place I wanted to go, which is that idea of, especially when you've had stuff traditionally published, or even if not, when you make that decision to go indie, right? So this is the point where you're making that decision. You're walking over from being not only the author, but now you're becoming the publisher. And this is one of those things that I think a lot of people don't necessarily have in mind when they decide to go indie, is that realization that now not only are you the author, you're also now the publisher, and you're carrying those responsibilities. So Layla, I'm gonna hit you with this one. When you made that decision of, hey, I'm ready to pull these rights back, I want to take ownership of this, I want to drive it, I want to control it, what were some of the things that led you through that decision-making process? And what told you were ready to take on that other responsibility?
I had actually did a lot of soul searching, but also talking to friends who had been with the same publisher and had left and were doing indie and were able to get involved into these projects, especially the shared world projects, where, with the shared worlds that we were doing, we were all responsible for publishing the books ourselves. They weren't something that we were submitting because we had to have them out within a particular time frame and with certain covers and modifications. So I'd done a couple of those, but I also had a journalism background and I had run a magazine before. So after all these conversations, I just felt comfortable of, okay, I have learned the formatting, who to go to for my cover art, what I want to do, how to brand these. And I just felt like I was ready to focus on the series and the things that I wanted to do, rather than be told, hey, yeah, we got your manuscript and it's great and we want to publish it and we have a room to put it out like sometime next year. That was the biggest thing for me, is having that control of, okay, I've got these 3 books, these 4 books, these 5 books in the series. I want them to come out every 3 months, and I couldn't do that with my traditional publisher. Things would just get pushed back due to other projects, and it's like that was really where I was at with it, where is that I've always got at least 4 projects going on, so to start having books get backed up for years of not being able to release them and lose the momentum of the first book was just not working for me anymore.
So when you made that decision and you were looking at covers and what were you thinking about in terms of what you needed to do to carry those indie to reissue?
Well, and that was the thing with my covers for my later books. I had gone to, I love working with Dan Skinner. I had gone to him. I'd gotten the art. I brought the art to the publisher. So I purchased the art outright myself so that I could continue. And then when I took the books back, it was my art to use. I didn't have to recover but one book. And we actually recovered it because it's a great cover. I loved the cover, but I was changing the title of the book, and there was an issue with the cover artist. I'd gotten emails and word that the cover artist was actually not the artist, but the cover model was in jail for a violent crime. And I wanted to get him off the cover of my book. So I went to Dan actually, and I said, hey, I need to recover this. I need to retitle this. What do you have for your old stuff where it's not so much the art stuff? I want to keep it a similar vibe to what I had. And he and I worked together and looked through his stuff and found what I was after. And I pulled it down and I had it back up within a week of being able to just recover it that way.
So, Alledria, and I want to come back to that conversation about the idea of other responsibilities outside of it, but we'll come back to that. So, Alledria, for you, when you look at work, have you done stuff to go back out there and kind of refresh stuff? Have you done re-edits? Have you, when you're pulling things back, what do for example, you were talking about the one book you had traditionally published that you're not sure what to do with it. What are your thoughts around what you might want to do? Do you want to find another publisher? Do you want to take it indie?
Well, when you consider my career, I actually started indie first and then went to having a publisher. And now in this particular case, my publisher has reverted my rights and I have the right to put the book back out. But I kind of liked the stuff that was done with it previously. So what has to be done with it is it does have to be recovered because it's not my cover art. But I will probably put it back out as an indie book and just join it in with all the other stuff that I have because I have a fair, decent backlist.
So, Alma, we talked about this when you're talking about what you went through, putting the new covers on and combining the book and everything else. We talked about this just a little bit when you were going through that story, but how big of a shift was it for you to go from traditionally published into that indie kind of a model, knowing that you were going to have to take on that ownership?
It's the writing and the editing and up to a point, even the recovering, because I know what I want and I know where to get it. That's not really the problem. My real problem with not being traditionally published is simply the marketing, because I am not, and I repeat, not a salesperson. I am a lousy self-marketer and one of those people who just quietly sits in the corner and waits for someone to come and talk to her, but nobody ever does. So you actually have to stand up and say, hey, I have a book. And in a lot of places that is frowned on, because sometimes in a Facebook group that I'm on, people come in and say, look, I'm looking for reading recommendations and this is what I'm looking for. A, B, C, D, E, F, these things I'm looking for a book. And even if your book is the poster child for those things, you're not really allowed to stand up and say, hey, I wrote a book that covers all your bases, because it's self-promotion and that's bad. And well, I can understand that up to a point, because there are some people who never shut up about their books, which is bad. But the whole moratorium on not being allowed to say anything at all about anything you've written, if you happen to be an indie published author, is really difficult. I mean, how do you get the word out about your books? People who come up with these reading recommendations, they'll usually come up with the same damn 6 books. People are going to come up saying, have you read this book? And then the next 5 people are going to say, oh yes, that book. And nobody else is going to talk about anything else at all. I mean, I'm just pulling it out of my head, but when it comes to young adult things, somebody's going to say Harry Potter and then everything else stops. It's just one of those things that you're kind of in a room full of elephants and you have to be really, really careful about where you step, because somebody's going to stand on you before you even have a chance to get out of the way. But that is part of it for me. The idea that the craft part of it, even the art part of it, up to a point, I can deal with all of that. But the selling and the marketing and the promo and the distribution, that tends to get away from me, and the depressing regularity. And you rely on word of mouth, but how can you rely on word of mouth? It basically depends on other people being willing to tell other people about, I just read this wonderful book, go and buy one, which may or may not work in a given time period. But that can make or break the trajectory of a book, just because nobody's reading it, because nobody knows about it. And what do you do about that?
Well, I mean, that is actually one of the biggest challenges. I mean, marketing is always one of the biggest challenges you've got. And how we approach marketing and how we do marketing. And this is one of those things that gets back into that idea of what do we do to rejuvenate a work, right? Because often if the marketing is not working, maybe it's the cover may be a great cover, but it's not reflecting the work, or the cover just may not be reflecting what you're trying to get. It's not grabbing the attention you want. Sometimes it's refreshing the blurbs. Sometimes it's refreshing, what's on Amazon. Sometimes it's just a matter of what do you do to your Facebook ads and your other social media ads, get stuff out there. It takes time and effort to refresh those things and see what it takes to pop. So Alledria, kind of thinking in terms of your indie work, in terms of reaching people. One of the questions I want to throw out to you guys is, have you looked at some of your prior work or looked at some of the things and said, maybe I need to refresh some of the content. Maybe there's pieces to it that need to be rewritten. Maybe there is something in it that we now know would be triggering, socially, politically, something like that. Or maybe there's just something in there that has changed so radically that if somebody picked it up, it would yank them out of the story. So have you thought about having to maybe refresh parts of the work itself?
That's actually why I changed the name. The original name of the book when it released was Gypsy's Rogue. And yeah, so when I went to my readers group, and I kind of let the readers pick the rename. So the new title for the book is Gemini's Rogue. And that was a big refreshing there, with changing the name, going through and just making sure that issue was dealt with, and then making sure I didn't have any references, because a lot of my characters live in the same world, making sure there was no reference to that character in any of the other books, and that their name was changed in the other books. The other thing I've been doing a lot of lately, book funnel promotions, is getting involved with that and using my newsletter, and which I never did before. I had to build the newsletter from scratch, and just build the newsletter and reach out to new readers that way, and attend more events. And sometimes you have to paint spots on the elephant. And I walked into a bookstore out in Peoria, Illinois, when I was out there this weekend for a conference, and spoke to the owner and actually got 8 books into the store. So sometimes you just have to talk your way through the door.
So Alledria, how about you? Have you thought about going back in and maybe refreshing some of the content, the writing, titles, anything like that?
I've thought about it, mostly because the reality is my first book came out in 2015. And I don't know about you, but my writing style isn't the same as it was in 2015. So at some point, I have to go back and reread and look at all of my early work, because I'm like, it's not an accurate reflection of how I write anymore, or the level of talent that I have. So it might actually make things a little bit better, given that I would be updating the information and also updating the style at the same time. Because the overall story, I would say dollars to donuts, the overall story in any of my books holds up. But the prose style and everything most likely needs to be refreshed.
Yes, and I've got an interesting thing that I've been playing with. I wrote my first really bad novel when I was 11. I wrote my first decent novel when I was 14, and that thing still exists in handwritten form. In basically pen in hand, I've got notebooks of it. I wrote it in 3 notebooks, 3 hardcover notebooks in pencil, if you believe it. Handwritten. Again, it's another 200,000 words, and I never wrote short in my life. But I wrote that when I was 14 years old. And as Alledria says, the story actually holds up. The story has good bones. But this is clearly a book written by a 14-year-old. And if I was going to go back to that, I need to go back and revisit the bones of the story and reanimate them with slightly different flesh, as it were, because as you said, your writing style does grow up with you and grow further with you, and it changes as you change. And even if your basic storyline that you're working with is still there, it may need that relook, refresh, rewrite because of the simple way that you're looking at it in a different way.
And one of the other things, and this is one of the things I said I wanted to come back to. Layla, as you've experienced, sometimes things happen that are outside of you. For example, your cover model goes to jail. There's an anthology I was in where some things came out about one of the contributors, which then got it pulled off the shelves. We see things happen at times where people are people, things happen. So Alma, I'm gonna kind of start with you on this one again. With your experience, have you ever run into a situation where something outside of your control like that led you to the point where you felt you needed to refresh something or pull something out of a particular edition? Or have you run into any of that kind of an experience?
I had a series of books that was placed with a small press, and I won't name them, but they basically sent me a placeholder cover that they were going to put in the books, which ended up being the final cover because they simply never got off their duff and got the final cover made. So the placeholder cover ended up being the cover that the book was published with. And as it happens, I quite like that cover by itself, but that's neither here nor there. That was not what they're contracted to do. And then they kind of ghosted me to the point where I kept on emailing them and writing to them and trying to talk to them, and I never got a response about anything. It was just one of those dead-end black hole things until I finally said, well, that's it. I'm taking the books back. And that took a while to happen again. But I finally got the books back, and I got them back out there. And this was a kind of trilogy type of thing. So I got them back out there in an omnibus edition, which has all 3 books in it, which works for me. It looks like it's a good book, and it's a good sized book now. And sometimes, especially when you're working with smaller presses or really small presses, they do have this firefly effect. They're there and then they're not. And you just have to deal with the fact that sometimes, when they disappear, they pull a lot of people in with them. And then it's a complete mess because, as you say, the rights and contracts can be messy. What happens if a publisher disappears overnight? What happens to all of those books? Who owns all of that stuff? And that can take years to unsort and unravel and untie Gordian knots because nobody actually bothered to get the legalese right to begin with, and everybody else then pays the price for it. I've got a good friend who had exactly that happen to him. He was with a press that was led charismatically by a single character, a single person. When that person died, the press kind of unraveled, and all the writers in the press were left how should we put this, dangling. He finally got back the rights to his book, and he was lucky enough to sell it to somebody else, and that's coming out end of the year, which is great for him. But not everybody can get that kind of, serendipity happening and be as lucky as. It's got nothing to do with you. It's got nothing to do with how good your work is. It's just sometimes it happens that you happen to be in the way of a wrecking ball, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Well, and that goes back to the idea of people remembering this is also a business, and there's anytime just to get a book out the door, there's a lot of businesses involved, big, small, publishers, services people, oh yeah, authors, we're businesses too, right? So Layla, is there, with that experience now of having to go through and look at the covers, is there anything else that you've gone through and looked at and said, any other experiences you've had, and has that experience of looking and knowing that you're having to refresh a cover for something entirely out of your control and out of your experience, does that change how you look at parts of the process?
The one thing it did do was make me cautious about, just where I got my covers from, who I contracted with to get my covers. And so I decided I'm really just sticking with, one or two people that I already work with on other projects, where I know that, hey, if something goes wrong, I can go back to them and I can quickly get a cover and replace it and get it back up. I did work on another project where some things happened with the authors in the shared world, and by the time we'd released all the books, a lot of us weren't on speaking terms with the organizer, and so it basically became we had these uniform covers. She was pretty much like, I'm washing my hands of this, and we were all like, okay, we're going to take the logo off, we're going to take all the branding off from your thing that you created, and we will just re-release our books and with new covers or fresher covers, and go that way. So we did, we removed the series logo and everything off of it and re-released the books with new covers and things on that as well. So there's been a few times, and I know I do have we were talking about refreshing things. I have a snake shifter book I would love to write part 2 of, and I have a paranormal that I would love to write part 2 of, but they were written about 7 years ago. So if I ever do sit down to do the part 2, I will be refreshing the first books and looking at the things that, I could tighten up about the world, or I could do differently, or just, my style has changed so much between then and now. I would definitely be refreshing those books and re-releasing them with the new story, with the second book that came out.
So, Alledria, have you run into any issues maybe with work you've been in, or anything that you have to consider about who you're working with, how you manage the contracts, how you deal with all of that sort of stuff because of maybe somebody you've worked with in the past or different projects you've been on?
Mostly no. I've been pretty lucky in that respect because I generally work with people that I'm aware of very well before I start going, hey, I want to show you this thing I did. And then it's like, oh, I get to show you this thing I did, and this person might be interested in it. But no, I've never really had one of those situations where something outside of like general publishing foibles have ever broken something. We started talking a little bit about marketing as well. I mean, because ultimately, often this is where one of the biggest reasons that we refresh work, right? Whether it's refreshing covers, refreshing blurbs on Amazon, refreshing our marketing, right? And Layla, I'm going to start with you on this one too. But when we're going through that kind of a process, are there particular things you look at in terms of the numbers
that say, oh, maybe this cover isn't working? Are there things that just tell you, I like the cover, but it's not doing things? For example, one of my series, the first time the book came out, cover was gorgeous. Cover was exactly what I asked for. The cover was 100% not the book. It was 100% not the genre. And we went and said, yeah, nope, that's not going to work. And the original cover, when it was with a small publisher before I pulled the rights back on it, the original cover really was not it, which kind of contributed to some of that. But the first cover I did was exactly what I asked for, but I pulled in the wrong artist, and it was a romance cover on urban fantasy. Beautiful cover, looked like a spy romance. Loved. One of these days, I would like to find a reason to use it, but it was not. It was not the cover for the book. Then I got a new round of covers done. Same artist for the first 3 books, as well as a spinoff series. All of that was working really well, and they sold well until they didn't. And when it stopped, and I went back another round of covers, and went through, also retitled at that point in time. Said, hey, we're going to do a full refresh, a little bit of a rewrite in them at that point in time to refresh the sales. And that's still the covers that are on that particular series now. And in fact, as I'm working on the next books in the series, when that next round comes out, I'll probably wind up recovering everything again, because I'll want to keep everything in series and that look and feel. So from your perspective, how do you look at marketing and making those kinds of decisions as to maybe it's time for a refresh, or maybe there's things that need to be an update?
One thing I look at is the response at the table at an event. The books that people are gravitating to, but also the books that, like, I have one that I realized just this weekend has a cover that people will pick it up and they'll look at it and they'll have no clue about the genre. They'll have no clue what's going on. They'll ask a lot of questions. They'll ask a lot more questions about that book because the cover really doesn't fit. I took some pictures of my layout and I'm like, man, okay, I've got 2 books up there that I've got to really look at, recover. It's time to recover them. They're not getting attention. The other thing will be which books are getting the clicks and the attention in the book funnel promos. If I've got 4 paranormals up and 3 of the paranormals are getting a lot of attention and one of them's got kind of an off cover, which it does, and it's not getting as many clicks and as many looks, that's a good indication of, okay, that cover that usually draws people in is not doing its job. And then I use my author group. Now, when I get ready to put a cover on a book, I start posting bits of it as I'm building it or as my artist is building it, depending on who's doing what. And I get advice from my readers. Hey, what do you think about this cover? What do you think about this variation? What does it say to you? And I let my reader group give feedback before I put a cover on a book now, which has really just helped with some of the elements, but with keeping them eye-catching and keeping them on brand so that I don't have 15 books on a display that all look like they belong to like 15 different authors.
About you, Alledria? Thoughts on marketing and how all these things look and brand and carry for you? Have you gone through looking at recovering books, redoing blurbs, redoing the write-ups on Amazon?
I've looked at it, but I'm going to admit I'm kind of lazy. So there are things that I know need to be looked at, that I know need to be fixed, but I'm also the person who goes, the backlist isn't as important as the front list in a lot of cases. If I take the time to redo the backlist and reissue everything, I'm basically retreading the same ground. So I triage those kinds of things. if there's absolutely something that like I'm getting reviews about that needs to be fixed, then that's one thing. But if it's something where it's just my personal preference, I would like to take the time and go through it, it's on a separate list. That list will get dealt with sometime in the future. I'm not going to guarantee that's going to happen before I die. It may be done posthumously, but just saying, I don't want to dig too deep into fixing my backlist because it eats time away from writing the next book.
So Alma, how about you?
I can live with that attitude. I can live with that. I'm also hearing Layla talking about the covers being a part of a whole, being a part of a brand. I'm in a slightly different boat because you may be writing within a specific genre and all of your books may be within brand, but I never write the same book twice, which means that none of my covers are going to be in line with each other, and if they're put next to each other, they're going to be saying, okay, this is the same author, this is my brand, I am the Duchess of Fantasy, I am the brand. The books that I write are all completely different. I've been writing through the length and breadth of the genre, and I basically just pick up the story that I need to tell and I tell it, which means that I've got historical fantasy books, I've got the so-called young adult stuff, I've got epic fantasy as such, I've got science fiction, I've got sort of, I wouldn't call it urban fantasy because that's a specific thing, but it's sort of, how should we say this, contemporary fantasy in a better way of saying it. So that cover is reflecting that. And that particular, speaking of the mom and pop fantasy, the publisher that I spoke of that had the second edition of the World Weavers books, they also had this book, and they put out a cover on it, which was interesting, but I didn't really like it all that much. So when I redid it with a different publisher, I found an image that I liked, and I said, use that. But on the flip side of that, we're all talking about the indie stuff, and we all have input into our covers and or designing them ourselves up to a point. If you're traditionally published, the thing more likely is to happen is that you're going to turn around and get handed something by the publisher saying, here, this is your cover, live with it. And if you're really lucky, you might have some kind of input in it, in the sense that my original Changer of Days cover got handed to me in a pencil sketch variation, which is unusual. Usually you get the finished kind of artwork. But I looked at this pencil sketch and I looked at this cliff that they had on it, and it had this Yeti-like creature that was sitting on top of the cliff. And I said, what's that? It's not in my book. Because if I'd gone with that, I would have had to either write the damned Yeti into the story so that it appeared somewhere, or face an endless quiz of what was that and why wasn't it in your story. The other caveat that I had with that particular cover is that I had camel-like creatures that appear in it, and the original pencil sketch had these two camel-like creatures which had these expressions on them that were, if I tell you they were Disney camels, you'd probably get a very good idea of what I mean. Yeah. They had these little saintly grins on them, and I wrote back to the publisher and I said, no self-respecting camel is ever going to wear that expression. Fix it. So I had a bit of input, but that was a pretty major kind of trad publisher, and that is extremely unusual to get that kind of level of input into your covers. And I mean, given that, the one before I went back and recovered it, rechanged it, redid it myself, I had no input into it at all. That was the cover. It sold or it didn't sell. That was the cover. They didn't ask you about it. They didn't change it. That was what they did. That was what they put out. That was the model back then.
Yeah, and I mean, even today, the larger the publisher, the less likelihood you've got even right to approve a cover.
Right.
But, we're seeing a lot more openness and acceptance of that, depending on what it is, over the years. So, we've covered a fair amount of ground tonight, what it takes to go through, do the refreshes. But I'm gonna throw this out there. Is there anything we haven't really touched on that you think we ought to, for somebody that was maybe looking at refreshing their work, refreshing a cover, they're just getting their rights back, anything along those lines? So, Alledria, is there anything we haven't touched on that you think we maybe should?
Make sure that you're doing this for something other than personal vanity. Just because, okay, so the first cover for Chains of Fate was an awful cover. It was a beautiful cover. It was an awful cover. But I got it for personal vanity. Just because I thought I knew what I was doing. Of course, this is also my first novel. Anyway, personal vanity doesn't really have anywhere to go in publishing if you are the publisher. Once you as a writer have finished the product, you basically have to look at it and go, this is no longer a baby, it is a product. And if you want the product to fly off the shelves, you need to do the job right, which may sometimes require you to go back and look at, did I do the job right the first time? But your personal vanity should have nothing to do with that decision.
Good point. I mean, because again, just because something is a beautiful piece of art does not make it mean it's a good cover. Or it may not be a good cover for that book. I mean, that's one of those things we all run into as we go, I love this cover. Still not the book. So, Alma, how about you? Is there anything we haven't talked about in this space that you think we ought to mention?
Yeah, I would tend to agree wholeheartedly with what was just said. Vanity has got no place in this. And, sometimes when you hear people say everybody's got a book in them, in a measurable number of cases that you can also say that is probably where that book should have stayed. There's a lot of people, because self-publishing is so easy these days, all you have to do is you have to format the book and slap a cover on it and it's out there. And everybody seems to think that's all they need to do, but it's not. You have to have, as Alledria said, the product. You have to have something that is worth being out there, and then you have to package that thing in a way that conveys that worth to a particular set of readers who will, take it on and run with it. And you need that before it'll be a success. You need that kind of measurable reader base that's going to pick it up, know it, love it, tell their friends about it. The word of mouth in this business is a very underrated but a huge part of this entire equation. Basically, a lot of the times your book, succeeds or fails by how many people are literally talking about it to other people. And when it comes to personal vanity, when it comes to writing, especially when it comes to, and I'm going to say this with a great deal of kindness, the passion projects, the people who come out there, who have this thing burning inside their head, who need to get the story out there, but who don't quite get to the point where that story is conveyed in the manner in which they think it exists inside their own head. And then the book doesn't go anywhere, and then they get despondent about it. And it may not be them. It may just be the fact that they don't know how to deal with the idea that they've got. And it may happen that at some point, somebody who puts out a project like that and it goes nowhere, and they might go back to it in 5-10 years' time, and they'll look at it and they'll realize why it didn't fly. So that means that you can rebrand, recreate, retool that dream, and somehow maybe, convey the original idea that you had, which you were simply not up to as a writer at that stage of development before.
Layla, any thoughts? Is there anything we haven't touched on you think we need to hit on?
I would just want to say with Alma, that was, I love that. I love that. We all, I think, have a pet project or a book that we look back on and say, oh my gosh, like if I redid this now with what I've learned, with how I've developed as a writer, what could I do with this project to enhance it? But I also think the other thing that's important when you do get to that phase of re-releasing, recovering, take the time to re-release and reintroduce each of those books. Don't just, replace the cover or replace this and slap it up and let it be silent.
Do the work. Yeah.
Yes. Take that time to do the work and to promote it. Promote it in your newsletter and on social media and on anything else that you use. Promote that book like you would the first time around. So it's not just some, hey, I just slapped a new cover on it and left it out there in Amazon land for somebody to maybe notice in 6 months. Hey, didn't this book have a different cover? You've got to do the work and put the time in each time you re-release and make sure that that book gets the same love and attention and traction that it did the first time around, and more so, hopefully, so you get more readers in and more eyes on it.
Well, I think we've gotten everybody ready to go out there and refresh their work. Time to refresh and resurrect. But appreciate everybody coming in tonight. But before we get out of here, let's make sure everybody knows where to come find you guys, your work, and be ready to help pull some more books off the covers or off the shelves. So Alma, you're up first. Where can we find you? Website, social media, and what's that book they need to go grab and add to that to be read pile?
Well, I'm at almaalexander.org because my alexander.com got stolen by a Chinese cat food company. Don't ask. But I'm at almaalexander.org, and that's got a book page on it where you'll find all my books on there. And you can just go through that and see what catches your fancy in terms of covers. But I'm on all the usual suspects. Well, these days, all the usual suspects are changing so fast, aren't they? I'm still on Twitter, which a lot of people are not. But I'm not kind of wedded to it. I just use it to put pictures of my cats on, really. And I'm on Facebook fairly regularly. And on the sort of social media sites like that. But my main one is the almaalexander.org. And I've also got a Patreon, which has a lot of original material on it, which people might want to go and explore if they want to throw a buck my way. In terms of what you need to get, the World Weaver series is out there right now. You can go and pick those up from, as it happens, Amazon, and from Bookview Cafe as well if you're into ebooks. That's a good place to get them.
Layla?
I am on Facebook, of course. I have a TikTok that I've neglected for a little while, so I will be reviving that. I'm on BookBub. I am on Instagram, which has kind of been my go-to. And you can find me at Layla Dorine 13, the number 13, at Wix.com. I've got a whole website up, and you can subscribe to the newsletter through there. And my email, actually, I have a author email, Layla Dorine 13 at Outlook.com. I love hearing from readers.
Alledria?
www.alledriahurt.com/books. You will find an somewhat inaccurate listing of books because I haven't updated it in a while. But c'est la vie. I guess I need to refresh my website.
So do we all. I got a couple that need to go up there now. And you can find me at jamesgnettles.com, authoressentialsworkshops.com, the Speculative Fiction Academy.com if you're looking for workshops. You can also find me at creatingprose.com, and of course, here at ConTinual. And we'll see everybody again soon.